Hi again, welcome to our second video on human evolution. Today we'll focus on the evolution of modern humans, our own species, Homo sapiens, and especially on the complexities of how new species evolve, a process called speciation. So all living humans today belong to a single species called Homo sapiens. So in the way this sort of naming and classification works, the first part of the name, Homo, is the genus, that's our genus, and the species epithet is called sapiens. So Homo sapiens is the full name. We're the only living species left in the genus Homo, but it does include fossil human ancestors and relatives going back a couple million years. So our species has only been around for a couple 100,000 years, but we'll look at sort of how we evolved and how we sort of related to our closest relatives in the last 100,000 years. So in this class, you've seen a lot of things like this, phylogenies. These things are a great way of showing evolutionary relationships. But one thing which you'll see today is that they really greatly simplify the process of how new species evolve. Right? So for example, they nearly always show speciation, so that this process of evolving a new species from an ancestral species, they nearly always show speciation as a simple branching process. They basically never have one species evolve directly from another. Right? So in these diagrams, the branching points are meant to represent a common ancestor, but they're not an actual species that we have fossils of. Right? So in reality, speciation can be much more complex. So that in these three examples here, the one in the center called cladogenesis, and it's called branching or branching cladogenesis, that's like the one shown in the phylogeny, right, where an ancestral species in green branches into two new species and is replaced. Right, so that's sort of similar to the tree. But there can also be a process called budding, where a new species evolves in gray, but the ancestor species continues to persist for a while. There also could be a process called anagenesis, where one species just evolves into another one, and where we would draw some kind of line, sort of semi-arbitrary line between the two when we looked at them in fossils. So what does this mean for human evolution? Well, there's very little agreement on how many species of our genus Homo there were, or how they're related, but here's sort of one common idea. So our genus first evolved in Africa along with all the other hominins that you've heard about before, but various species have left the continent of Africa at various times. Right? So one of the earliest, more widespread species that we know of was Homo erectus, which evolved in Africa. Sometimes the African ones are called Homo ergaster, by some people at least. But then the species expanded its range to live throughout large parts of Asia as well. Also note that there's Homo floresiensis from Indonesia, which might be a distinct species that evolved from erectus or perhaps some other earlier hominin. Homo sapiens, our species, is thought to have evolved from African populations of a species called Homo heidelbergensis. Now, sometimes those African ones are called Homo rhodesiensis by some people. And then there's Neanderthals, which is Homo neanderthalensis, sometimes thought to be a species or a subspecies by different people, and that evolved potentially from a European population of Homo heidelbergensis. So this is already kind of complicated. There's lots of names. There's lots of different groups and different populations evolving. This is more realistic because species exist over a certain geographic area. Right? Sometimes it's a large area, and there are multiple populations within that area. So, this is maybe more realistic than our simple, just branching point on a tree. But there are some recent advances that show that even this is not as complicated as it really was. So the first really exciting development in this field was the sequencing of the genome, or the complete genetic code of Neanderthals. Right, so Neanderthals are no longer around. But people were able to use ancient DNA from fossils that are tens of thousands of years old to get the Neanderthal genome. Right? Although DNA is a very fragile molecule, there are techniques now that mean that you can sometimes get DNA from fossils that are within the last million years or so right now, especially if they're preserved in cooler or cold places. Right? So Neanderthals from caves within the last 100,000 years have sometimes yielded DNA. Right? And so this genome helped to document a split between Neanderthals and modern humans that took several 100,000 years between sort of the initial genetic divergence, finally to sort of complete separation of the two groups. Right, so speciation is not an instantaneous, not, maybe it is sometimes, but generally is not an instantaneous thing. So the Neanderthal genomes also revealed another surprising fact, which is that non-African populations of humans today contain a little bit of Neanderthal DNA. So if you have any non-African origin ancestry in your family history, you'll have some DNA that initially came from Neanderthals. Right, so this has been interpreted as interbreeding between Neanderthals and our species Homo sapiens as our early human ancestors expanded out of Africa and then met the Neanderthals who were living in Europe and Asia at the time. But it's actually even more complicated than this. There's evidence from the Neanderthal genome for an earlier episode of interbreeding, apparently with a population of Homo sapiens that expanded out of Africa more than 100,000 years ago. That human population no longer exists, there's no trace of them anymore, but some of their DNA lives on by being passed to the Neanderthals and then kind of back to a different human population later on. So it's probably worthwhile to take a short detour and talk about what makes something a species. Right, if Homo sapiens and Neanderthals were able to interbreed and produce children, are they different species? Well, it turns out that the definition of what makes a species has some fuzzy edges to it. Right. So a common species concept used in biology is that different species either can't or don't interbreed successfully. Right. If they do occasionally interbreed, the offspring don't survive, or the offspring themselves can't reproduce, or whatever. Right. So this concept works fine for the vast majority of things, but there are probably more hybrids with different species as their parents than you might guess. For example, polar bears and brown or grizzly bears can hybridize and have done repeatedly so in the past. Some brown bear populations actually contain substantial polar bear DNA in them. And the eastern coyote, or there's something called the coy wolf, is derived from interbreeding between coyotes, wolves, and dogs, domestic dogs. Some people argue that it should be a separate species. Other people disagree. Right, so it's possible for a species to be distinct and clearly identifiable and recognizable over a large area of its range, even if two neighboring species can interbreed and hybridize and produce offspring where they meet each other, as in the case of crows from Europe and Asia shown here. Right, so the bottom line is that there's really no 100% certain definition for what makes a species. I mean, probably because populations and lineages are always evolving and they're sometimes separated from each other in certain ways. So there definitely is some subjectivity involved in what we name as different species. But wait, there was Neanderthals, but it turns out there was actually not just Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Ancient DNA has revealed a third group of humans as well, and they've been called the Denisovans. They don't have a formal taxonomic name yet because they're known from very limited bone and tooth material, not enough material to define what makes them a species based on their morphology, but their genome suggests that they're related to but distinct from Neanderthals. So even more complicated than we thought. But are these three groups, are they just, maybe three subgroups of one bigger species? Maybe we could have two species, Homo sapiens and then Denisovans are just like a separate branch of Neanderthals, for example. Or maybe we can say there's three species, with Denisovans being a separate species on its own. Well, I mean, this is kind of a judgment call. There's some subjectivity here, but we'll come back to this in a bit. Oh, and guess what? Homo sapiens and Denisovans interbred as well. Right, just like we did with Neanderthals. Presumably as modern Homo sapiens expanded into Eastern Asia, and this is because bits of Denisovan DNA are found in modern populations, except for people from Africa, Europe, sort of the Near East and Western Asia. Some modern populations, especially in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands area, have sort of particularly high contributions of Denisovan DNA relative to other humans. So again, even though Denisovans are also now extinct, Homo sapiens would have brought that DNA as humans expanded into East Asia, Oceania, and ultimately North and South America. Well, the Denisovan genome also revealed kind of another surprise, and that is a DNA contribution from an unknown or a mystery hominin. And so this mystery hominin diverged from the Homo sapiens Neanderthal-Denisovan group more than 1 million years ago and was around somewhere and interbred with Denisovans at some point, in the last 100,000 years or so. So, this means that our tree here is getting pretty complicated with lots of these interbreeding arrows between branches as Neanderthals interbreed with Denisovans and Denisovans interbreed with humans and on and on. Well, it's unclear who this mystery hominin is, but one sort of plausible speculation is that it's the remnant of the Asian population of Homo erectus. Homo erectus originated in Africa, but then expanded out of Africa more than 1 million years ago, and is known from fossils in a variety of parts of Asia, even as young as 100,000 years ago. It's also possible that there were other archaic or older hominin groups present in Asia, as there are a couple of species from Asian islands, including Homo floresiensis from Indonesia, Homo luzonensis from the Philippines, and these species might represent sort of relatives of an even earlier expansion of humans out of Africa, even before Homo erectus. But in any case, at this time, about 100,000 years ago, there may have been 5 or even more than 5 distinct groups, perhaps distinct species, of humans of the genus Homo throughout Africa and Eurasia, likely interbreeding with some or all of the other groups. Perhaps were they connected? Maybe like with the crows, maybe these human groups were distinct throughout much of their range but could overlap at the edges. Right, so our species at this point, Homo sapiens, had been evolving in Africa for some time, perhaps sort of as one group that spread out, or perhaps as multiple populations all evolving from an ancestor. But then ultimately, Homo sapiens expanded out throughout Asia and then later throughout the whole world, interacting with some of these existing species. Right, so all these groups were around 50, they were all here about 50 or 100,000 years ago. By about 10 or 20,000 years ago, our species, Homo sapiens, was the only one of these humans left. Well, Denisovans didn't just interbreed with our species. This is perhaps an extremely surprising and really remarkable find. So there's a bone fragment, this here, just like a little piece of bone from the Denisova cave, and it revealed this sort of shocking ancestry when its genome was sequenced, because this individual, called Denny is the name they gave to it, was a first-generation hybrid with a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. So not just like, we don't just know that there's like bits of DNA. This individual had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. So really kind of a remarkable find. So that means that there was interbreeding between groups really all over the place, creating a very complicated and messy process of speciation. A mixture of perhaps budding of groups from groups, anagenesis, where a species will evolve directly into another one, evolution occurring in these sort of different and partly separated populations, and with only sort of incomplete separation between the species, allowing quite a lot of interbreeding and genetic exchange between the two. Right, so this obviously seems a lot more complicated of a picture than everything else we talked about in class when we talked about dinosaurs and arthropods and all these other groups. That might just be because we know a lot more about human evolution. It's been studied in a lot more detail. We have all this amazing ancient DNA stuff which we don't have, and the genomics that we don't have for these older fossils. It's possible that human evolution is messier because we have been a very widespread species over huge areas, and the groups move around a lot. So, it's very likely that speciation, even with dinosaurs or with mammals or arthropods or clams, was probably often a messy and kind of drawn out process like this in lots of animal groups, with a lot of these same complexities of budding and anagenesis and interbreeding and genetic admixtures and multiple populations evolving differently. So all these complexities that we now understand from the study of our own species probably apply to many, many speciation events as well. All right, so we'll end off by stepping back in time to talk about who is the ancestor of all these species here. most of the ancient DNA work has come from the last 100,000 years, so it hasn't been as informative for identifying which fossil species is the ancestor of humans, Denisovans, Neanderthals, right? Who 400, 500, 700,000 years ago was the ancestor. There hasn't been a lot of genomic work, but there is a 400,000 year or so old specimen from Spain that was called Homo heidelbergensis based on the bones, but its genome has been sequenced and it shows that it's a direct Neanderthal ancestor. Maybe it even is a Neanderthal, but in any case, it supports the idea that heidelbergensis, the European populations at least, could be a direct ancestor of Neanderthals and probably of Denisovans as well. Now, it doesn't really help us tell if the African populations were the direct ancestor of modern humans, Homo sapiens, but it seems like it's possible still. But it's still an open question. Maybe there'll be new genomic and ancient DNA work that can help solve this. But that's all for now. I just wanted to really emphasize, how this process of speciation is really complicated, but how much we can learn about it from looking at the evolution of humans and our recent relatives, and how much a lot of these things probably apply to speciation for lots of different types of animals.